I was shocked when I saw my wife cheating on me with a priest, and when I asked why they were doing this, I was told that it was for the sake of performing a holy act. Now I will tell you how it all started. My name is Dan Williams. I've been married to Rachel for 14 years. 14 years of trust, laughter, struggle, and faith. And I thought we were solid. Like everyone, I suppose, I believed our relationship could withstand anything. But life has a way of blindsiding you, doesn't it? Rachel and I met in college. She was studying to be a teacher. I was going into civil engineering. She had this quiet faith and warmth that drew people in, like gravity. I wasn't particularly religious back then, but I could see how deeply it shaped her. Over time, I joined her for church services on Sundays, eventually becoming close to Father Tom, the young priest who'd recently taken over our parish. Rachel admired him deeply. Tom was charming and friendly, someone you could sit down with for a beer, someone who made faith seem relevant and accessible. So, I got used to the Sunday ritual. We'd attend service, sometimes stay to volunteer, and I'd watch Rachel come alive within the church walls. Her devotion was a beautiful thing to see, and I suppose, in a way, I saw it as a pillar of our marriage. Our faith was our anchor. Until recently, things at home had been different. Subtle things. At first, I shrugged them off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. Rachel seemed to be spending a lot more time at church, helping with evening events, organizing charity drives, and talking frequently about community support. I admired her dedication, really, but I also felt a weird ache in my gut every time she left. There was an air about her that didn't feel right. I dismissed it, telling myself I was overthinking. And then came the whispering. One Thursday night, I came home from work to find Rachel sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with an intense look on her face. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood by the doorway, just watching her. Eventually, she looked up, startled, and quickly locked her phone. She plastered on a smile and asked about my day, her tone a little too cheery. When I asked what she'd been looking at, she brushed it off, claiming she'd been responding to a message from her church group. But something was off. I knew it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was around that time that Father Tom started showing up at our house more often. He'd pop by for church planning, meetings, or drop off supplies for charity events Rachel was coordinating. It was odd, seeing him in our home so frequently, but he was a friend, and, honestly, a great guy. When I asked Rachel about his visits, she said he was helping her plan a series of workshops for the community. I shrugged, figuring that maybe it was just her way of getting more involved in church. But the oddities kept stacking up. Rachel would disappear on weekends, claiming she was doing home visits for some of the elderly in our parish. It was noble, and I didn't want to question her. I didn't want to be the husband who doubted his wife's good deeds. That changed one night in May. I'd come home from a late meeting, drained and wanting nothing more than a hot meal and a quiet evening. I was heading upstairs to change out of my work clothes when I heard voices. Rachel was on the phone, and I couldn't make out the conversation, but there was a softness in her voice, a gentleness I hadn't heard in a while. And then I caught a phrase that made my heart stutter. "I know it's risky, but it's worth it. I'll see you soon, Tom." A part of me broke in that instant. It was surreal, like I was hearing a line from a poorly written movie. The notion that Rachel, my Rachel, would ever do something to betray us felt impossible. I confronted her that night. It wasn't planned, it wasn't calm, but I needed answers. "Rachel," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, Are you seeing someone else?" She stared at me, eyes wide, as if I'd slapped her. "What? Dan, what are you talking about?" "I heard you," I choked out, my heart pounding. "I heard you on the phone. You said you'd see him soon, that it was worth it." "Who is he, Rachel? Is it Tom?" Her face drained of color, and she looked down at her hands. I waited, praying she'd tell me I was wrong, that it was all some huge misunderstanding. But she didn't deny it. "Yes, Dan," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Tom." The room spun, and I had to sit down. All these years, I'd believed in us, in our faith, in her faith. But now, standing there in our living room, I could hardly recognize the woman I'd thought I knew. How long?" "Only a few months," she murmured, tears welling in her eyes. But Dan, please understand. It's not what you think. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, really? Then what is it, Rachel? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Her touch felt foreign, like something I didn't want near me. It's complicated, she said softly. Tom and I, it wasn't meant to happen this way. Did you fall out of love with me? The question felt pathetic as it left my lips, but I had to know. I'd thought we were happy. I'd thought we were strong. Is that it? Was I just not enough? Her eyes filled with a kind of sadness that felt almost theatrical. Dan, I love you. I do. But Tom, he helped me understand something deeper. He helped me realize that there are different forms of love. You know how much my faith means to me, don't you? Apparently not, I muttered, bile rising in my throat. You're talking about faith as if it justifies all of this, as if it explains why you're cheating on me with a man of God. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath and said something that floored me. Dan, please, you don't understand. This isn't a betrayal. It's a calling. A calling. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What? Is this supposed to be some divine affair? Some holy union? She held my gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet conviction. Yes, Tom and I, we believe we're doing something right, something meaningful. We're sharing in God's work. At that moment, the rage was eclipsed by something colder, darker, a strange numbness. I didn't know what hurt more, her affair or her conviction that this was somehow good, righteous, even. I was left there, staring into the eyes of a stranger who wore my wife's face, trying to understand the depths of the betrayal. It was as if every part of my reality had shattered in a single moment, and I was left with nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. And just like that, I knew this was only the beginning of something darker. The days that followed felt like a strange, endless fog. I couldn't shake the things Rachel had said, that this affair was somehow righteous, that it was a calling. Her words played on repeat in my mind, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. I tried to shake the feeling, to tell myself that she just lost her way. But every time I looked at her, that serene expression, that unwavering calm, I felt a surge of anger mixed with a sickening sense of betrayal. 3 days after that awful conversation, Rachel asked me to sit down. She said she wanted to explain. I didn't want explanations. I wanted her to realize what she'd done. But I sat down anyway, gripping the edges of my seat to keep from flying off the handle. She spoke with a composure that was chilling. Dan, she began, I know this is hard to understand, but this isn't about love or attraction. It's about something deeper, something spiritual. Tom and I, we believe we're sharing a form of love that goes beyond human desire. My jaw clenched. Rachel, stop with the holy rhetoric. You're sleeping with another man, a priest, no less, and you're telling me it's spiritual? How exactly am I supposed to take that? She looked at me with pity, as if I were a child who couldn't comprehend. Dan, I know you don't see it now, but Tom and I truly believe we're doing something pure. We've spent hours talking about this, praying about it. We both feel that we're fulfilling God's work. I let out a bitter laugh, unable to hide my disbelief. God's work? You really expect me to believe that this affair is some kind of divine mission? Yes, I do, she said quietly, meeting my eyes with a calm that made my stomach turn. You know, Dan, the Bible talks about love as the highest calling. Tom and I, we're exploring that. We're trying to transcend our earthly roles and find something higher. I couldn't stand listening to it. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to calm the fury building inside me. Do you even hear yourself, Rachel? You're twisting everything, faith, marriage, even morality, to justify this. How can you believe this is right? She just watched me, that calm gaze never wavering. I know you're hurt, Dan, but this is something you may never understand. Tom believes that love, true, pure love, is a form of worship. It's a way of connecting to the divine. I didn't plan on this happening, but it feels like it was meant to be. I wanted to shake her, to scream until she realized what she was saying. But a part of me knew that nothing I said would change her mind. She was so far down this path, so blinded by this twisted ideology, that any words I threw at her would just slide right off. Instead, I asked, "How long has this been going on?" Rachel hesitated, then looked down, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "About 6 months," she said quietly. 6 months. Half a year. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. All this time, she'd been coming home to me, acting as if nothing was wrong. How many lies had she told? How many times had she looked me in the eyes, pretending everything was fine? "I need some air," I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. Rachel didn't try to stop me. She just watched me go, that unreadable expression still plastered on her face. Outside, the cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to ease the boiling rage. I started walking, letting the anger guide my steps. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house, from Rachel, from the twisted reality she was trying to sell me. As I walked, my mind raced, filled with memories of our life together. The early days of our marriage, the laughter, the shared dreams. I thought of the quiet moments, the late-night talks, the way she used to look at me. It felt like all those memories were tainted now, poisoned by her betrayal. But more than anything, I felt the sting of her certainty. She wasn't remorseful. She didn't see this as a mistake. To her, this was a holy mission, a good deed. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how deeply that belief had seeped into her mind. After an hour of walking, I found myself outside the church. It was empty, the doors locked, and the building loomed over me in the dim light. For years, this place had been a sanctuary, a place of peace and comfort. But now, it felt cold, almost mocking. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, my mind still heavy with the events of the night before. Rachel was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her Bible open. She looked up when I walked in, her face soft with concern. "Dan, please, let's talk," she said, her voice gentle. I wanted to refuse, to storm out and never look back. But I couldn't. A part of me still loved her, still wanted to understand. So I sat down across from her, my arms crossed, waiting for her to say whatever twisted justification she had prepared this time. "Dan, I know you don't see this the way I do," she began, her tone calm and measured. "But Tom and we've been discussing a lot about love and sacrifice, about what it means to truly serve others. We believe that our relationship is part of something bigger." "Bigger?" I echoed, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Bigger than our marriage?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. It's about reaching a higher state of compassion, a deeper understanding of faith. Tom believes that in giving ourselves to each other, we're experiencing a form of divine love. It's not about us, Dan. It's about something beyond us." "You're out of your mind," I spat, feeling the rage flare up again. "This isn't divine love. It's betrayal, plain and simple. You're abandoning everything we built together for. For what? Some twisted philosophy?" Her face softened with pity, and it took everything in me not to scream. "Dan, I know this is hard to hear, but Tom and I believe that by transcending our earthly ties, we're getting closer to God. We're living out a form of sacrificial love." I could barely believe my ears. Sacrificial? "Rachel, you're throwing away everything. Our marriage, our life, everything we built, just to follow some diluted idea of sacrificial love. You don't even see the damage you're causing, do you?" She looked away, a flicker of something, maybe guilt, crossing her face. "I'm sorry that it hurts you, Dan, but this is something I have to do. It's something I believe in." I stared at her, feeling a strange numbness settle over me. "You believe in this more than you believe in us?" Rachel didn't answer. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. Every time I looked at Rachel, I saw a stranger. The woman I'd loved for 14 years was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who believed in a twisted version of faith, who saw her betrayal as a form of holiness. But the worst part was that Father Tom began to show up more frequently. He'd come by in the evenings, and Rachel would greet him with a calm warmth that sent a chill down my spine. They'd sit together, discussing their so-called mission, while I sat in silence, feeling like a ghost in my own home. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. After Tom left, I confronted Rachel once again. Do you even realize what you're doing to me? Do you care about anyone but yourself? She looked at me, her eyes calm, almost serene. Dan, I'm not trying to hurt you, but you have to understand, this is something bigger than either of us. It's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. A sacrifice? I laughed bitterly. You think you're some kind of martyr? You're not sacrificing anything. You're just destroying our marriage. She sighed, her expression soft with pity. Dan, you may never understand, but Tom and we're doing God's work. At that moment, I realized just how deeply she'd bought into this delusion. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to apologize. To her, this wasn't a betrayal. It was a mission, a calling, something pure and righteous. I went to bed that night feeling empty, lost, and utterly alone. The woman lying next to me wasn't my wife anymore. She was a stranger who had convinced herself that her betrayal was a good deed. And as I lay there in the dark, I knew that the worst was yet to come. Days turned into weeks, and my mind remained a battlefield of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Rachel's actions were one thing, but her utter conviction that she was on a righteous path, that her betrayal was somehow a higher calling, was something I just couldn't grasp. Every attempt I made to understand seemed to lead me into a deeper pit of disbelief. And then there was Father Tom. He kept visiting, strolling through my front door as if he belonged there, acting like he was bringing some kind of divine light into our lives. The man had counseled us in our marriage for years, had listened to our dreams, even prayed over our family. And now, here he was, sitting in my home, smug and certain, like he hadn't torn my world apart. I knew I had to confront him. I couldn't keep sitting in the shadows of my own life, watching this farce unfold. It was a Sunday afternoon when I decided to drive to the church. It was deserted when I arrived. The pews were empty, and the quiet was almost eerie. I made my way through the dimly lit aisles, my footsteps echoing as I headed toward the back, where Father Tom's office was located. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked on his door. "Come in," came his familiar voice, calm and unbothered. I opened the door and stepped inside, finding him seated at his desk, reading over a Bible. He looked up, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it guilt? Fear? But just as quickly, his face returned to its usual mask of serene calm. "Dan," he said, setting the Bible down, "I wasn't expecting you." I closed the door behind me, leaning against it. I could feel the anger simmering just beneath my skin, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We need to talk." He nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Of course. Please sit." I didn't move. "Why?" The question was all I could manage, my voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this? You were supposed to be our guide, our friend. You know how much Rachel loves you, how much we both respected you." Father Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Dan, I understand this is difficult, but I need you to know that Rachel and we didn't plan for this to happen. It was never our intention to hurt you." I felt a bitter laugh escape my throat. "Hurt me? That's all you've done. And you're still doing it, Tom. You're still coming to my house, still filling Rachel's head with this delusion that what you're doing is somehow holy." He folded his hands in front of him, his gaze steady and unervingly calm. "Dan, I understand that it seems unconventional, but Rachel and I share a bond that goes beyond the physical. We believe we're carrying out God's work together. It's something that transcends the typical boundaries of marriage." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Are you even listening to yourself? You're a priest, Tom. You took vows. You promised to uphold a life of integrity, to guide people, to help them find peace. And now, you're destroying a family and calling it a holy act?" His expression didn't change. "Dan, in the Bible, there are many examples of individuals who broke societal norms in the pursuit of higher truth. Rachel and I believe that we're being called to something beyond the conventions of this world. I know it's difficult to understand, but our love, it's a manifestation of our devotion to a higher calling." Something inside me snapped. "No, Tom, It's not devotion. It's a betrayal. You're twisting faith to suit your needs, to justify your selfish desires. This isn't divine. It's cruel. Do you even see what you're doing to her? To me? He looked at me with that maddening, pitying expression, like I was a lost soul who simply didn't comprehend the truth of what he and Rachel were doing. Dan, I know this is hard for you. I know it hurts. But Rachel and I are trying to transcend human limitations. We believe that through our love, we're expressing a form of worship. Worship? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. Do you have any idea what you sound like? You're tearing a family apart under the guise of righteousness. You're not some martyr, Tom. You're a hypocrite. He sighed, almost as if he were weary of my presence, as if I were the one imposing on him. I'm sorry you feel that way, Dan, but my conscience is clear. I know this is what God wants for me, for Rachel. My fists clenched. And what about me, Tom? Where do I fit into this holy plan of yours? He looked at me, a hint of sympathy flickering in his eyes. Sometimes, Dan, sacrifices have to be made. This may be your path as well, to learn from this, to grow, to find a higher purpose beyond your own pain. I felt my blood run cold. You're using God's name to justify an affair. You're talking about sacrifice like it's something noble. But what you're doing is cruel, selfish, and destructive. Father Tom shook his head, a sad smile on his face. I hope one day you'll come to understand. I truly do. Without another word, I turned and left his office, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and helplessness. I had come seeking answers, some kind of closure, but all I found was the twisted justification of a man who was so deep in his delusion that he saw himself as a martyr, a saint. Back at home, Rachel was waiting for me. She must have known where I'd gone, because as soon as I walked through the door, she was there, standing in the hallway with that familiar, pitying look. You spoke to Tom, she said softly. Yes, I did, I replied, barely able to keep my voice steady. She stepped closer, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away. Dan, please try to understand. Tom and I, we're not doing this to hurt you. Not to hurt me? I laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. Rachel, do you even hear yourself? You've destroyed our marriage. And you think it's some kind of divine mission? Do you even care about the pain you're causing? Her eyes softened, and she looked at me with that maddening pity again. Dan, I love you. I always will. But love isn't confined to one person, one relationship. I'm trying to follow my heart, to serve something greater than myself. So you've decided to rewrite the rules of morality, just like that? I snapped, unable to contain the bitterness. All those years we spent building this life together, the promises we made, was that all meaningless to you? No, of course not, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But love can be complex, Dan. Tom has shown me a different path, a path where I can explore my faith in ways I never thought possible. I felt sick, dizzy, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea how to get back. So this is it, then? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You're choosing him. Over me. Over everything we built. Rachel's face crumpled, and she looked away, her silence all the answer I needed. In that moment, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I realized that the woman standing in front of me wasn't the Rachel I had married. She was someone else, someone who had allowed herself to be consumed by an illusion, by the lies of a man who had no right to call himself a priest. Without another word, I turned and left the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. I drove around aimlessly for hours, the night stretching on as I tried to make sense of the chaos my life had become. My thoughts kept circling back to Tom's words, to Rachel's twisted conviction that her betrayal was somehow a good deed. The absurdity of it all left me feeling hollow, like I was drifting in some surreal nightmare. Eventually, I found myself parked outside an old friend's house, Joe, a guy I'd known since college. He was one of the few people who'd seen me through thick and thin, someone I knew I could count on. I knocked on his door, and he opened it, bleary-eyed and disheveled. Dan? He asked, blinking in confusion. It's the middle of the night. What's going on? I need to talk. I managed, my voice raw. Joe let me in without another word, handing me a beer as we sat in his living room. I told him everything, every twisted detail, every justification Rachel and Tom had given. And by the end of it, I was shaking, barely able to keep my composure. Joe just stared at me, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. Dan, that's insane. I know, I whispered, feeling the weight of the words settle over me. I know it is, but she believes it. She really believes it. Joe shook his head, rubbing his hands over his face. You can't keep going on like this, Dan. You can't keep letting them do this to you. You need to get out. I looked at him, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I know, and I think it's time I did. Because in that moment, I realized that Rachel wasn't coming back. Not the woman I'd known, not the woman I'd loved. She was gone, lost to a delusion so deep that I couldn't reach her. And I was done trying. After that night at Joe's, I couldn't bring myself to go back home. The reality of Rachel's betrayal, her conviction that this affair was somehow a sacred act, sat like a stone in my gut. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss I didn't recognize. And in that moment, I realized that staying away from her was the only way to keep my sanity. I booked a room at a nearby motel, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Days slipped by in a haze as I sat alone in that cramped room, wondering how my life had come to this. I had built everything with Rachel, our life, our dreams, our family, and now she was tearing it apart with the guidance of a man who claimed it was God's will. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. Dan, please come home. We need to talk. Tom thinks it would be good for all of us to sit down together. The sheer gall of it made my blood boil. How could she ask me to sit down with Tom, to talk, as if we were solving a minor disagreement? As if this wasn't my whole life falling apart. But against every instinct, I decided to go. If only to get answers, to finally confront them both and lay bare the mess they'd made of everything I held sacred. That night, I drove back to the house. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Tom's car parked out front, its presence a bitter reminder of how far this had all gone. My heart pounded as I walked up to the door, wondering what I would say, how I would keep my anger in check. Inside, Rachel and Tom sat at the dining table, waiting. The sight of them together, seated so comfortably in my own home, turned my stomach. Rachel looked up, her eyes searching my face, while Tom's expression remained calm, placid. "Thank you for coming, Dan," Rachel said softly. I took a deep breath, crossing my arms as I stayed standing, looming over the two of them. "Say what you need to say," I replied, my voice colder than I'd intended. Tom exchanged a look with Rachel before turning to me, his face etched with pity. "Dan, we know this is difficult. Rachel and I never meant to hurt you, but we believe that this is part of a higher plan. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made in the pursuit of spiritual truth." "Stop," I snapped, my voice barely contained. "Don't patronize me. You've both spent months lying to me, twisting the meaning of marriage, twisting faith itself. And now you're sitting here like this is some noble sacrifice?" Rachel reached for my hand, but I pulled back, unwilling to let her touch me. "Dan," she murmured, "please try to understand. Tom and we're experiencing something that goes beyond anything I ever thought possible. I know it doesn't make sense to you, but this is about finding a greater love, a love that's as close to God as we can get." I clenched my fists, the words catching in my throat. "So you think tearing apart our marriage, betraying everything we built, is part of this calling?" Tom spoke up, his tone gentle yet infuriatingly condescending. "Dan, sometimes we're asked to let go of earthly ties to find true meaning. Rachel and I feel that we're honoring God by pursuing this path." "Honoring God?" I could feel the anger flooding through me, my voice rising with every word. "You're hiding behind God to justify your own selfishness. There's nothing holy about what you're doing. It's cowardly, delusional." Rachel flinched, but Tom held her gaze, his calm, saintly demeanor never faltering. "We can't expect you to understand, Dan," he said, as if he were explaining something to a child. "But we hope that, in time, You'll see that this was necessary, that this is part of a divine plan. I shook my head, feeling the last remnants of hope crumble. There was nothing I could say to make them see the devastation they'd wrought. They had twisted everything I thought I knew about love, about faith, about trust. And they believed, wholeheartedly, that they were in the right. Is this what you wanted to tell me? I asked, my voice hollow. That all of this is justified because you believe it's a higher truth? Because if that's all you've got, then you're both more deluded than I ever imagined. Rachel's face softened, as if I were the one she felt sorry for. I'm sorry, Dan. I truly am. But I have to follow my heart. This is something I need to do. I looked at her, feeling a strange, numbing clarity settle over me. Then I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Rachel. But you won't find it with me. Without another word, I turned and walked out, my heart pounding as I shut the door behind me. This time, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. There was nothing left here for me. No love, no trust, no future. Just the hollow remnants of a life that had once meant everything. That night, back at the motel, I felt a strange, aching emptiness take hold. I didn't know what lay ahead, or how I would rebuild the pieces of my life. All I knew was that the Rachel I'd loved, the Rachel I'd built a life with, was gone, lost to some twisted version of faith that had destroyed everything we shared. I sat in the dark, my mind replaying every word, every justification, every feigned expression of pity. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of relief. Relief that I was finally free from their lies, from their twisted version of righteousness. But as I stared into the shadows, I knew that the scars of this betrayal would stay with me, haunting every corner of the life I now had to rebuild alone. In the days following that final confrontation, a strange kind of silence settled over my life. It was a quiet I hadn't felt in years, like the absence of something heavy and relentless. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of Rachel's lies, her twisted explanations, or the sickening presence of Father Tom. And yet, even in that silence, I was far from free. I found myself driving aimlessly, revisiting places that once meant something to Rachel and me. The coffee shop where we'd had our first date, the park where we'd planned so many family outings. But every memory was tainted now, shadowed by the betrayal that had upended everything. Even the most ordinary places felt hollow, like they belonged to a life I could never get back. Eventually, I returned to Joe's house, where he welcomed me with the kind of silence only a true friend could offer. He didn't ask questions, didn't push for details. He just let me sit there, lost in my own thoughts, as I tried to make sense of what my life had become. The days blurred together, each one feeling both painfully empty and strangely calm. The storm had passed, but it had left a wasteland in its wake. Then, one morning, a letter arrived for me at Joe's house. It was from Rachel. I stared at the envelope for a long time, my heart pounding as I wondered what on earth she could possibly have to say now. Part of me wanted to rip it up, to throw it away without a second thought. But another part of me, a part one still didn't fully understand, wanted closure. I needed to hear, one last time, whatever excuse, whatever twisted justification she had left. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Dear Dan, I know that you may not want to hear from me. After everything that's happened, I don't expect you to understand, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted to write this letter because, for all that's changed, I need you to know that what we had was real. The years we shared, the love we built, it was all real to me. When I met Tom, I felt something I couldn't explain. A pull, a connection that went beyond the surface. I know it must seem selfish, even cruel, to say that, but I felt like I'd found a piece of myself I didn't know I was missing. With him, I felt a kind of closeness to God, to faith, that I'd never experienced before. I know you see it differently, and I understand why. But in those moments with Tom, I felt as though I was discovering a part of my faith that had been dormant. He opened my eyes to a kind of love I never thought possible, a love that felt sacred, almost holy. I don't expect you to understand. I'm not even sure I fully understand it myself. But please believe me when I say that I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you, Dan, with all my heart. I still do. But my love for you and my love for Tom, they're different, and yet somehow they both feel real. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for you to take me back. I know that bridge is burned, but please know that I will always be grateful for the life we shared, for the years you stood by me. You gave me so much, and I hope in some way I did the same for you. With love, Rachel. The letter fell from my hands, landing on the table as I stared at the words, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and something that felt close to pity. She still didn't see it. She still believed that what she'd done was somehow virtuous, that her betrayal was justified by some mystical sense of purpose. Even now, she couldn't see the wreckage she'd left in her wake, the pain and destruction that her so-called faith had caused. But as I sat there, rereading the letter, I felt the first glimmer of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Closure. It wasn't the kind I'd hoped for, and it wasn't the kind that made the pain go away. But it was something, a final answer, a last piece of the puzzle. She was gone, lost to a delusion that had taken everything from us. And there was nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, I began to piece my life back together. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, a place that didn't hold any memories of Rachel or the life we'd built. I returned to work, filling my days with projects and meetings, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to the past. Joe was there every step of the way, his quiet support a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. And slowly, painfully, I began to move forward. The anger faded, replaced by a kind of numb acceptance. I stopped wondering what Rachel and Tom were doing, stopped caring about their twisted mission. They were out of my life, and I was determined to keep it that way. Months passed, and though the wounds still ached, they began to heal. I found new routines, new ways to fill the empty spaces that Rachel had left behind. I started going to the gym, took up cooking, even joined a book club, just to remind myself that there was life beyond the pain. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years, Sarah, an old friend from college. We got to talking, laughing about old times, and before I knew it, we were making plans to meet up again. It was just coffee, just a simple conversation. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark of hope, a glimpse of the life that lay beyond the ruins of my past. And as I walked home that night, I realized that I was ready to let go, ready to move on from the betrayal, from the lies, from the twisted version of love and faith that had shattered my world. Rachel and Tom had taken so much from me. They'd stolen my trust, my peace, my sense of security. But they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my future. And as I walked through the quiet streets, breathing in the cool night air, I knew that my life, my real life, was just beginning.